We now return to NC Spin.
We continue our discussion about the outcome of the Easley hearings. So far as it goes, a lot of politicians have been involved in and watching very closely all of this that's taken place. Chris, I want to pick up on something that you talked about. The state board unanimously recommended that the Wake County District Attorney, as prescribed by state law, investigate with the possibility of prosecution this case. Now, as you said, Cullen Willoughby and Mike Easley were good friends. They used to go hunting together and so forth like that. He recused himself and then announced that Rowan County DA Bill Kennerly is going to handle the investigation. John, I guess the question that I've got is, does Cullen Willoughby have that authority? Why shouldn't this go to the Attorney General's office or to someone else if he's not able? Basically, he just named Kennerly a special prosecuting district attorney. Is that correct?
I've got to believe that that decision was not made without consultation with others, including people at the Attorney General's office. I suspect that will not end up being that would not have been announced unless it was sufficiently vetted. Cullen Willoughby's a smart man.
Yes.
Well, now
and a straight guy, straight up guy.
When we were doing the ethics standards and the lobbyist improvement in their activities, that question came up as to whether or not Cullen Willoughby or the Wake County DA should be the one that handled those cases. And I think it is state law now that he would be, and he wanted to keep that role.
Yeah, and so therefore he had the authority to name somebody.
That is correct.
All right.
What's interesting, though, I do think, what's interesting about this, and I agree with John that this was vetted, but in criminal cases, like violent crimes, for example, a murder case where and this has happened many times, where there's a conflict of interest in the DA's office, whether it's a family member or something, the Attorney General's office steps in and takes over the case. So that's why I do think it's a little odd that the Attorney General's office isn't now prosecuting the case. Maybe they thought there was too big of a conflict there.
Elaine, what's the situation so far as Bill Kennerly? We know he's a Republican. We know he's a district attorney from Rowan County. Was he the only district attorney in the state that had not had some relationship with Mike Easley or been appointed by Mike Easley or served on? I mean,
I do not. I do not know. I agree with what John said earlier about Cullen Willoughby has always, in these last several years when we've had extremely high pressure cases, acted very honorably and with pretty strict ethical standards from what I can tell. So you can only imagine that it was discussed with a lot of people and this was decided to be the most impartial way to handle it.
And it's worth underlining something that I think was mentioned before. I think that almost everybody involved in this process, except maybe a few people in the media who weren't paying close enough attention, knew that this was going to be referred for investigation before the Board of Elections hearing ever started. That's why the hearings were staged.
The first day of the hearings were staged such that, I mean, one of the questions that was asked, I think David Crabtree interviewed Meg Scott Phipps, and she said, you know, Easley's getting off light. They interviewed me first and then interviewed all the other witnesses after me. Why didn't they interview Mike Easley first?
Because they didn't want to tip him off on everything that they had.
Well,
this is a more complex story.
But they did.
They did eventually. The point is they didn't interview him first. They interviewed him afterwards so they could compare. They could ask him questions about what McQueen Campbell said and get him to say incredible things.
All right, so what are we going to expect from this DA investigation and reporting? I mean, most of the folks that we've talked with, Gene, seem to feel like that this is a secondary, an investigation of secondary importance, and that the federal investigation is what we're really waiting to see what comes out of that. Is that a good impression?
I totally agree with that. And let me back up what you're saying. Cullen Willoughby is just a top-notch guy, and you can expect only the highest ethical standards out of him. But no, the feds outrank the state, and if there's going to be a penalty, the sentence would be a great deal more on the Fed side.
Well, think back to Jim Black. We had Board of Election hearings with Jim Black. He was convicted of state crimes, but the federal offenses were more serious, and he actually served those sentences concurrently.
All right.
But keep in mind that assume that there is going to be also some kind of federal action. The state still has an interest in making sure that its campaign finance laws are followed, and that in particular the felony, that if that is what they ends up being charged with, the felony of falsifying, of making up stuff, not just failing to report, but making up campaign finance.
All right, this is a good segue into what I want to get to next. The board recommended that because of the fact they imposed a $100,000 fine on Mike Easley's campaign, and the campaign doesn't have $100,000, the board recommended that the legislature draw up a law that says that the candidate would be personally responsible for any fines and forfeitures under the circumstances. Elaine, is that a good law?
I mean, I think that would be a good next step. I think they kind of picked that number based on sort of what the campaign had before they started having legal fees. So I don't think it's necessarily that number that we should stick out. But I also think there's lots of little things we can do to tweak the rules and regulations. But as long as we have a system that rewards, well, that forces everybody running to constantly be thinking about where am I going to get that next $4,000 check, whether it's written to me or it's a bigger check that's written to the party, an earmarked for me. And we've got to design a system that doesn't work that way if we're going to fix this. We're not going to fix it with these little rules and tightening the regulations.
All right, well, quickly, let's talk about what kind of reforms would we like to see? Campaign finance reforms, election reforms, would we like to see?
The first thing is, and whether or not, I don't think it would solve the problem ultimately, I still think we need to limit the amount of money political parties can give to candidates. This wouldn't solve all the problems, but it would make them, I think, at least more transparent. Why should political parties be able to give a candidate $50,000, $100,000, $500,000 when PACs and individuals can only give the candidate $4,000?
Is that the right way to approach it, or is the better way to approach it to say people can give as much as they want to, but the party can't spend more than the state law allows currently for a candidate to receive, either in kind or cash expenditures, which is $4,000?
To his point, though, the transparency is the key. They're going to give the money. They're going to get it from all over the country. So if you track that and make it so that everyone can see who gave the money and where the money was spent, then I think that you would see people start doing the things that they ought to do. The money is the feeder.
Well, if you're going to have individual campaign limits, and I'm not crazy about them, but you have to have consistency. So you can't, as Chris was saying, you can't say individuals can only give $4,000, but you can evade that one way, which is to go through the state party and use particular. So I do think that that's true, but remember that you can still give unlimited amounts, and I think should be able to give unlimited amounts to state parties for general purposes,
right,
which are going to help people like the governor.
But we all know that's not what goes on.
But no, I mean, even if you did it properly, you're still benefiting the governor's election.
You can go public financing.
Well, all right. If you're a political candidate, what do you take away from these hearings? John?
Don't be such an idiot. I mean, let's be clear about this. The governor was not raising a whole bunch of money because he was worried about re-election in 2004. He wasn't. They raised a lot of money, put it in his campaign account so he could live off of it, fly on it, pay himself to rent his house out to his campaign. This guy was greedy. He put his hand in the pill one too many times. People finally caught him. That's what this is about.
Gene,
the candidate is responsible for his campaign, and he should be throughout all phases.
Yeah, I think the candidate ought to have to sign a statement on every campaign statement that says, I have reviewed, and to the best of my knowledge, this report is accurate.
I don't disagree with any that's been said, but I would also add, Gene mentioned public financing. It would be interesting to have, if I was a politician, I would try to lead the reform brigade and actually finally get to the bottom of this big money stuff. I think the public is now ready for a different way to finance campaigns, so it makes this less likely.
The problem's not the public, is it, Elaine? It's the legislature.
Well, right. And, what I want to say also about this issue of trying to crack down on the money given to the party and the big donors is if you go in that direction, and this is why we need campaign finance, if you go in that direction, what will happen is what happened at the national level. We'll start creating all these 527s in North Carolina, so they'll just create another loophole. The next step is the opt-in public finance.
The 527s are the greatest thing to happen to television stations in the last decade.
That's where all the money will go.
If you missed the broadcast of our show, it's easy to catch the latest edition. Just visit our website, ncspin.com, and click on the webcast button on the left to view the entire show. You can also see archived editions of NC Spin, or you can hear the radio version by visiting the website and clicking on the NC Spin radio button. Keep up to date on the latest debate on ncspin.com.
NC Spin will return after these messages.